verses 1 through verse 6. The word which came to Jeremiah from the Lord, saying, Arise, go down to the potter's house, and there I will cause thee to hear my words. Then I went down to the potter's house, and behold, he brought a work on the wheels. And the vessel that he made of clay was marred in the hand of the potter. So he made it again another vessel, as seemed good to the potter to make it. Then the word of the Lord came to me, saying, O house of Israel, can I do with you as this potter, saith the Lord? Behold, as the clay is in the potter's hand, so are ye in mine hand, O house of Israel. Again, Jeremiah lived in a very difficult time in Judah's history. The revivals that were led by King Josiah, all of those are a distant memory, and idolatry and immorality plagued the kingdom of Judah. And again, as we've said, they were following the very same footsteps of the northern kingdom. And due to their incessant rebellion against God, the judgment of God was looming. But before God's judgment of Babylonian captivity would come upon them, God, out of love and grace and mercy and goodness and long-suffering, raised up and called a man by the name of Jeremiah to preach to them. And Jeremiah would preach God's message again during the last days of the nation. It's a nation that's in a state of rapid spiritual decline. A nation that was facing the destruction from God. And God would continually come to Jeremiah and put in him the message that he wanted him to deliver to the people. In our text, we see Jeremiah under the direction of God, and he's in the potter's house. And it was there that he would receive a message from God, and it would be the 9th message to the people as you follow from chapter 1 on. And the message that Jeremiah would receive in the potter's house reveals this truth: that though God's judgment was looming, God was reaching out to his people well into the 11th hour, calling upon them to repent. And I believe that's where we are today as well. Same situation as the southern kingdom of Judah. God's judgment is looming. It's coming. But God still reaches out way into the 11th hour, calling unto his people. So again, we want to follow Jeremiah to the potter's house. We want to speak upon helpful observations in the potter's house. What we see in the potter's house ought to be of great help to us. Certainly ought to be an encouragement to us in the life that we are called upon to live. Before Jeremiah got to the potter's house, there are some valuable lessons to be gathered prior to him entering the potter's house. Back in chapter 1, if we go there, verses 4 through 10, we have record of Jeremiah's call to preach. In this call, he is instructed concerning the place he was to preach, the people to whom he was to preach. Verse 7, "For thou shalt go to all that I shall send thee." You preach where I send you to preach, is what God is telling Jeremiah. He's also instructed there in verse 7 concerning the source of what he was to preach. "And whatsoever I command thee, thou shalt speak." Jeremiah, you preach what I tell you to preach. You preach where I tell you to preach. You preach to whom I tell you to preach. And you preach what I tell you to preach. In this call, he is told that in obeying the call, he would face intimidation. It says in verse 8, "Be not afraid of their faces." And in chapter 1, verse 17, "Be not dismayed at their faces." He is told that there would be opposition. In verse 19, "They shall fight against thee." But in light of all these things, these sound like discouraging words, he was reminded by God, "I am. I am." Notice verse 8. "Be not afraid of their faces, for I am with thee to deliver thee, saith the Lord." Verse 19, "They shall fight against thee, but they shall not prevail against thee. The reason, for I am with thee, saith the Lord, to deliver thee." So he's called to preach, and he is told that the people will fight against you. The people will oppose you. And we see the "I will" of God in verse 12. "Then said the Lord unto me, Thou hast well seen, for I will." For I will. Verse 15, "For lo, I will." In verse 16, "And I will." So he's telling Jeremiah, you just do what I tell you to do. I'll be with thee. I am with thee, and I will. And you have the "I have" of God. In verse 18, "Behold, I have made thee this day a defense city." That is, Jeremiah, you personally are like a defense city and an iron pillar and brazen walls against the whole land. That is, all their opposition cannot harm you because of what I have made you. So Jeremiah is told and is called to preach that there would be fierce opposition. And in verse 17, he's told to be in a state of readiness. He says, "Thou therefore gird up thy loins and obey God." And he goes on, "Arise and speak unto them all that I have commanded thee." Jeremiah was being taught in his call the lesson of obedience. Jeremiah, you obey me. Regardless of what anyone else does, you simply obey me. Now in our text in verse 1, chapter 18, verse 1, we see, again, Jeremiah learns this lesson of obedience. The word from the Lord came to Jeremiah, instructing him, "Arise, go down to the potter's house." Up to this point, Jeremiah has preached 8 messages. No positive results. And now God says, "Go down to the potter's house." And he gave him a promise. You go down to the potter's house, and there, at the potter's house, nowhere else, there, I will cause thee to hear my words. I will give you the message that I want you to preach, the next message I want you to preach to people, and I'll give it to you at the potter's house. So God had something special for Jeremiah at the potter's house. In verse 3, then, on the basis of God's direction, I went down to the potter's house. God told Jeremiah what to do. Then I went. That ought to be our life. God says go, then I went. God says do this, then I did. Jeremiah, having arrived at the potter's house, notice verse 3 again. Then I went down to the potter's house, and behold. And behold. Again, that's a verb describing, it's a word of exclamation, it's a word of wonder. And behold. Obedience to God will fill your life with behold. Obedience to God will fill your life with the extraordinary. We don't see a lot of things. We don't behold a lot of things because of disobedience. And behold, obedience will fill your life with wonder. Obedience will cause you to live in life with exclamation point. Behold. So Jeremiah arrives at the potter's house, and he was caused to observe and give serious thought and consideration to what was going on in that house. In the potter's house, he saw what he could not see anywhere else. There, God said, you go, and there I will give you a message. And I believe Jeremiah stood quietly, observing what God had for him. And as he stood there and observed and gave attention to what was going on in that house, God spoke to him. Verse 5 says, then the word of the Lord came to me, saying, as he's observing everything that's going on. And there was, in verse 6, an explanation from God concerning what he had just observed, revealing that he was to declare these truths to the people. God revealed to Jeremiah. Where was it that God revealed to Jeremiah? In the potter's house, being where God told him to be. God will reveal a lot of things when you obey Him. When you obey Him. There's much benefit in obedience to God. So now we want to look at some observations that Jeremiah made in the potter's house. The first thing he observed was the potter. So he arrives at the potter's house. The very first thing that he mentions is the potter. Notice verse 3. I went down to the potter's house, and behold, he. It's not, and behold, the wheels. It's not, and behold, the clay. I went down to the potter's house, and behold, he. He saw, and he intently observed, and gave serious thought and consideration to the potter. To the potter. In the illustration here in Jeremiah 18, the potter is the main thing. Always is. Always is. As Jeremiah enters the house, There's a work going on. There are the wheels. There is the vessel made of clay. But the wheels and the vessels that were being made of that clay are all relative and subjective to the potter. Behold, he. This is what had Jeremiah's attention, was the potter. So Jeremiah, observing the potter, also saw the wheels and the clay. But in seeing the wheels and the clay, what he really saw was the potter's ability to use the wheels, to use the clay. Jeremiah, observing the potter and the wheels and the clay, he's seeing the potter's sovereignty. The emphasis is not the wheels. The emphasis is not the clay. The emphasis is the potter. That'll always help you in life. Get the emphasis in the correct spot. It's not the wheels. It's not the potter or the clay. It's the potter. So we see in observing the wheels and observing the clay, he sees the potter's sovereignty. Those wheels are the potter's universe in a sense. And he's in complete control of what is taking place. He's in complete control of those wheels. How fast those wheels go, the potter controls that. The shape that the clay is molded into, the potter in complete control. Everything is subject to him. So Jeremiah, observing the potter and the wheels and the clay, he knows, doesn't take a rocket scientist, he knows that without the potter, there's no work going on. It'd just be wheels, not doing a thing, and a lump of clay. Without the potter, nothing's happening. So it is today. Without the potter, those wheels and that clay are without meaning. They have no purpose. Enter the potter. Now, those wheels have purpose. The clay has purpose. Remove the potter. The wheels have no purpose. The clay has no purpose. So in the illustration that God is causing Jeremiah to see, the potter is the source of everything that's going on. We need to see that. We need to see that. Many times, all we see is the wheels, the providence of God, the happenings of life. Life is happening. This is happening. That is happening. And that's all we see. At times, all we see is the clay. But we need to see the potter. Behold, he. Behold, he. Now, in the illustration, of course, the potter represents God. Notice verse 6. You have, I, has this potter, saith the Lord. So the potter represents God. And as the clay is in the potter's hand, so are ye in mine hand. So the potter represents God. No matter what the effect, the wheels have upon the clay, again, the potter's in control of the wheels. He's in control of the clay. The clay is in the potter's hands, and the wheels are under his control. So it is today. We are in his hands, and all the happenings of life are under his control. And no matter what happens in life, I do not experience it outside of his hand. Everything I experience in his hand. No matter what the effect of the wheels, we're never severed from his hand. Again, verse 6, the clay is in the potter's hand, ye in mine hand. This personal observation will help and encourage us in life. What Jeremiah saw that day in the potter's house was that God, and not the wheels, and not the clay, is the main thing. It's the main thing. Don't make, ever, well, whatever, don't make ever the happenings of life the main thing. It never is the main thing. The one who controls the happenings of life is the main thing. And that's God. Don't ever make the clay the main thing. It's God who's in control of the clay. You remove God, the wheels do nothing. The clay, just a lump of clay. The wheels and the clay are not to be viewed apart from the potter. So we're not saying ignore the happenings of life, ignore the clay. That's not what we're saying. We're saying do not view the happenings of life, do not view the clay apart from the potter. Don't remove God. God's people are good at that. They're skilled at it. They have an ability to take the happenings of life and remove God from it. And that's how the happenings of life overcome them. See the potter. Always see the potter. It'll help you in life. He observed the potter at work. So it's not just that he saw the potter is doing the work. Notice what it says there. And behold, he wrought. He was engaged. He was producing a work. He was creating something. There was a work going on. And the potter was doing the work. So it is today. Again, he wrought a work. Again, the main thing is not the work. The main thing is he wrought the work. Without he, you remove he, there's no work going on. Nothing's happening. He wrought a work. It wasn't a random work. Because as he observed the potter at work, he saw an intelligent and a capable worker that worked with purpose and method. Well, I don't know why God's doing this. Just know God's doing it. That ought to be comforting. As Jeremiah observed the potter, he noticed that the wheels were not just going round and round without purpose. And he noticed that the fingers of the potter were not just working aimlessly and without purpose. He couldn't help but notice that the potter had a purpose. And he had a method of accomplishing that purpose. Always be mindful. God has a purpose. God is always working that purpose. You don't have to know the purpose. All you have to know is God's working His purpose. And that will help you in life. You don't have to understand. All you have to know is that God is in control. And God is working His purpose. God's people say all the time, well, we know God's in control. Do you? That's easy to say. Well, God's in control. Yes, He is. But how often do we really know that? How often do we practice that? As Jeremiah observes the potter at work, he sees that the potter has authority over the wheels and over the clay. He sees that the potter has power over the wheels and the clay. He sees that the potter has rights over the wheel and over the clay. People talk all the time of my rights, their rights. What about God's rights? God has a right to do whatever He pleases. The potter is exercising his authority, his power, his right in the governing of the wheels and in the governing of the clay. And everything is under his control. Everything is under his control. You may watch a potter at work, and you may not know why he moves his hands this way, or why he moves his hands this way, why he handles the clay here, why he slows down the wheels here, why he speeds up the wheels here. You don't need to know. You just need to know he knows what he's doing. He's in control of all of those things. And when we realize that, it'll help us in life. In verse 3, he wrought a work on the wheels. Again, you have the lower wheel, and the lower wheel was larger, and it was connected by an axle to an upper wheel. The potter would turn the lower wheel with his feet, and this, of course, turned the upper wheel. In Ezekiel 1, verses 15 through 19, again, wheels are used to illustrate the providence of God. Many times it just seems that those wheels are just going round and round and round. That's never the case. There's a purpose. By the providence of God, we are referring to the actual doing or perhaps the permitting of things that God has purposed. To put it simple, it is God working His plan. God working His plan. It's the happenings of life. It's the occurrences of life. And God's in control, working His plan. Things do not just happen. God is in control. God is causing them to happen, or allowing them to happen. But regardless, it's for His purpose. Again, the wheels illustrate the providence of God. That would include the trials of life, God's chastenings, the circumstances of our life. Sometimes one part of the wheel is at the top and then at the bottom. And it's all done by a single revolution, all done, all under the control of the potter. Jeremiah observed that the potter determined when the wheels move. He determined at what pace they moved. And he determined when they stopped. He was in control. God governs the wheels. God governs the happenings of life. And when everything seems out of control, all you have to know is it's not. God's in control. And Jeremiah observes the potter at work. He sees that the potter has a purpose and is working everything according to that purpose. Notice verse 4, he was doing everything has seemed good to the potter. Has seemed good to the potter. And God knows all things. He's perfect. And He allows things to happen and He causes things to happen as it seems good to Him. Owes us no explanation. We just need to know it's in God's plan. The potter, he has a plan for that clay. He has a purpose. And he does not deviate from it. He's not distracted. It is declared in Ephesians 1:11, the purpose of Him who worketh all things after the counsel of His own will. When the truth of God's providence grips our hearts and minds, that'll help us in life. Jeremiah, in observing the work of the potter, he observed that the potter governed both the wheels and the clay. The potter, while causing the wheels to turn, held the clay in his hands. His government of the wheels and the clay were not independent of one another. God is causing those wheels to turn for the clay, to perform His purpose for the clay. And the potter would determine the effect that the wheels would have upon the clay. He knows exactly what he wants that lump of clay to be. So he controls the effect of the wheels upon the clay. The happenings of life have an effect upon us. And God's in control of all those things. Why is it that some things, it could be things that are on the other side of the world, they have a great effect upon us. And then there are other things that are happening in our own world right there, and they have little effect. God's in control. God causes the happenings of life to have effects upon us. We may be in the same place at the same time. Something happens, and it affects you in a completely different way than it affects me, or vice versa. God's in control. God causes the happenings of life, and He causes the effect. And it all goes into making that lump of clay a piece of pottery. It's God shaping us. Again, He governs the wheels. He governs the clay. And the firm belief and assurance of that truth will always help you in life. Romans 8:28, all things work together. Nothing happens independently. All things work together. That's the amazing thing about your life. You look back on your life. There are many events in our life that something happens and it seems like it's completely disconnected with everything else. That's never the case, because all things work together. And as you look back on life, you can see this happened to cause this to happen, and this, and this, and this, and you begin to connect the dots. It can be what we consider good things, it can be bad things. But they all work together for good to them that love God. They all work together for the good of that clay that's in the potter's hand. God works His plan, and it involves the clay. It involves the clay. As Jeremiah observes the potter at work, he sees in verse 4 that the clay is in the hand of the potter. That lump of clay, the potter is interested in that clay. That's amazing. That's amazing. The potter is interested in that clay. He's not only interested in it, he's working on it. He's working on that clay. He's handling the clay. He's shaping the clay. And again, God, He could be working on us. He could be smoothing out this part. He could just take this part off. Doesn't need to be there. He just takes it off. That's God. That's God working on you and I. He's handling us. He's shaping us. Again, eventually causing us to be conformed to the very image of Jesus Christ. But until we get there, in the meantime, He is conforming us. And He's doing so with great attention. He's paying close attention to the wheels, and He's paying close attention to the clay. You see, the wheels and the clay are connected, all forming the purpose of God. His eye is never lifted from the clay. It's always the clay. His eye is on the clay. That's so with you and I. And all the while His hand is just molding that clay. We read in Isaiah 64:8, "But now, O Lord, Thou art our Father, we are the clay. Thou art potter, and we the work of Thy hand." We the work of Thy hand. Again, from this to this, it's all the work of God's hand. That ought to help us in life. That ought to give us hope. Not only for ourselves, but it ought to give us hope for others. God can take any individual and transform it from a piece of worthless clay to a vessel for His honor and His glory. So, neither the wheels nor the clay determined what God did. Life does not determine what God does. God's not a reactionary God. God's in control of life. The wheels do not determine what the potter would do. Neither did the clay. He was the determiner of both the wheels and the clay. And when that truth grips your heart, it'll help you in life. In his observation, he's reminded of position. In verse 6, O house of Israel, can I do with you as this potter, saith the Lord? There's a question. And then there's a statement. Behold, as the clay is in the potter's hand, so are ye in mine hand, O house of Israel. Jeremiah observed position. He observed that he is the potter. He is the potter. We're the clay. Don't ever reverse that position. Why do people hate the doctrine of the sovereignty of God? Because they want God that's clay. A God they have in their hands, a God they can mold, a God they can control. Sovereignty of God doesn't allow that. Man hates it. He hates the sovereignty of God. Why does it offend man that God went and dug this piece of clay out of the ground and formed it? Because man wants to think that he can evolve and bring himself out of the ground and make himself better. It's all grounded in humanism. Man is getting better and better and better. No man left to himself is this. And will never be anything better than this. Well, we just need to have better education. That won't fix this. That won't change this piece of clay. Only God can go and dig up the clay and make it something. And people hate that because they want to believe that they are in control of their destiny. But Jeremiah observes a position. The potter, the clay. And that potter could do whatever he wanted with that clay. If he wanted to, he could throw it to the side and leave it there. It's his right. He could do whatever he wanted with the clay. Why does God make this bigger than this? Because he wanted to. Why did God give this several uses and this very limited uses? Because he wanted to. He's in control. He's the potter. We're the clay. He's the potter. We're the clay. Don't ever forget that. Did not God have the right to give this one design and this another design? Certainly he does. That's God's right. Well, it's not fair. I'm not like this. God's in control. God's in control. And God is the designer. God is the designer. To make whatever shape he wants to make. Paint it, put designs wherever he wants to. He has absolute right. He has absolute power. He has absolute control. over the clay. The clay belonged to him. Now, of course, with God, not so with just the potter, but with God, the clay belonged to him before he even dug it up. We belonged to him. We were his. When the truth of God's position and our position relative to God grips our hearts, it'll help us in life. These observations from within the potter's house ought to cause us to trust God. Trust him. Rely upon him. He's the governor of the wheels and the clay. A lot of things happen that I don't like. A lot of things happen you don't like. We need to see God at the wheels. God's in control. God's in control. And I'm in his hand. Things may happen. We don't like it. We don't understand it. We don't know why. God doesn't stop it. Is it because he can't? No. It's because he doesn't want to. If God wanted to, he would. It's because he's working his purpose. He's at the wheels. I'm in his hand. So I'm safe. Such ought to overflow us with comfort and joy. When God said, "Cannot I do with you as this potter?" Well, most certainly he could. But he was exhorting Judah to relinquish all and just become the clay in the potter's hand. Just relinquish all. Quit fighting against God. It's like the guy stuck at the bottom of the hill in his truck, in his pickup truck. He's stuck in the mud at the bottom of the hill. Bigger truck comes along and says, "I'll pull you out. I'll pull you up to the top of the hill." So there they go. They get to the top of the hill, and the guy who was pulling the truck says, "Man, there for a while, I wasn't sure we were going to make it up that hill." And the guy that was being pulled said, "I didn't either. That's why I had my foot on the brakes all the way." That's what we do. That's what we do. We try to be in control. Try to be in control. Cannot I do with you as this potter? Relinquish everything. Submit ourselves to the potter. That clay is passive in the hand of the potter. And that's what we are to be with God. Just let God do his work upon us. Life is so much more enjoyable. We're the clay, he's the potter, no matter what. But life is so much more enjoyable when you come to the realization of these truths. He's the potter, I'm the clay. Much happier life when you're not fighting against God's perfect will. So, what a blessing to be the clay in the potter's hand. Brother Dave, if you'd come and lead us in verse